So good afternoon. I'm Virginia Brissett, the CEO of the Jewish Council, located in Gainesville, Florida, the heart of North Central Florida. It is my pleasure to represent the Southern Alliance for Jewish Education in welcoming you to From Sephard to Savannah and Beyond, Southern Jewish Cooking and Culture with Sara Gardner. We are absolutely over the top thrilled with how many of you have chosen to spend your afternoon with us today. We hope that you'll be able to tune into all three of these sessions, but don't worry if you can't, we will be recording them and they will be made available on YouTube. The Southern Alliance for Jewish Education, known as SAJE, is an informal group of Jewish congregations and other organizations who network to share program ideas and opportunities like this one today. This Cooking and History series is the third webinar that we've offered together as a group. If you appreciate this learning opportunity today, please consider making a donation to one of the sponsoring organizations who made this program possible. They are the Jewish Council of North Central Florida in Gainesville, Florida, Temple Bethel and Temple Emmanuel of Birmingham, Alabama, Temple Israel of Brookline, Massachusetts, the Temple of Israel in Wilmington, North Carolina, and the Tommaso family of Augusta, Georgia. I am now turning our program over to Rabbi Emily Losman-Ostrov of the Temple of Israel in Wilmington, North Carolina. Rabbi.
Shalom, everyone. It is great to see some old friends and new friends, and so excited about my brand new friend, Sara Gardner, who's going to lead us in such a wonderful program. Before I officially introduce her, since this is a Jewish event, a Jewish gathering, let me go ahead and share my screen so that we can together offer a few prayers. Again, it is such a blessing to be together, so why don't we take this opportunity to thank God as well. So first, I'd like for us to offer the blessing in which we thank God for commanding us to engage in Torah. We may not actually be taking out the Torah scroll, but as anyone who cooks, I'm not one, but definitely someone who loves to eat, can tell you that there's definitely a lot of Torah in cooking, for sure. So I invite you to unmute yourself and repeat after me. I'll say a few words at a time, and that will allow us to almost sound like we're together and deal with the cacophony that is this wonderful Zoom. So again, I invite you to unmute yourself for just a moment, and please repeat after me. Baruch atah Adonai.
Baruch atah Adonai.
Eloheinu melech haolam.
Eloheinu melech haolam.
Asher kidishanu b'mitzvotav.
Asher kidishanu
b'mitzvotav.
Itzivanu la'asok.
Itzivanu la'asok.
B'divrei Torah.
Torah.
Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, sovereign of the universe, who hallows us with mitzvot, commanding us to engage with words of Torah. And for that, let us say Amen.
Amen.
And as my congregants know, I never miss an opportunity to say a Shehechianu. And this is truly a Shehechianu moment, a wonderful time as we are all coming together. We have people from up and down the East Coast, all the way through the South to the West Coast. And I think we have some people with us from Canada and other countries as well. So this is truly a wonderful, awesome moment of us all being together. And so I want to invite you to repeat after me in our blessing of gratitude. We are grateful to God for Sara and grateful to God that we are all here together. So please, again, repeat after me. Baruch atah Adonai.
Baruch atah Adonai.
Eloheinu melech haolam.
Eloheinu melech haolam.
Tehechianu.
Tehechianu.
V'kiyamanu.
V'kiyamanu.
V'higianu.
V'higianu.
Hazman hazeh. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, sovereign of all, who has kept us alive, sustained us, and brought us to this wonderful moment of being together. And for that, again, let us say Amen.
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 Wonderful. Well, I'm so excited that we are all coming in together. I'm going to introduce Sara in just a moment, but want to make sure that everyone is familiar with Zoom. I think by now a lot of us have become aficionados, but just in case, as a reminder, you'll be able to toggle if you're on a computer between speaker view and gallery view. Also, you'll be able to move the screen for anything that's being shared if you would like. And we also will have the chat function open so that you can chat either individually with someone or even sending a message to the entire group. So with that, I am, unless there's any other questions about the Zoom or anybody have anything, feel free to put any comments in the chat as well. Feel free to introduce yourselves and say welcome. And I am very excited to introduce our special guest. Let me go ahead. We want to make sure and we spotlight you, Sara. So hold on one second. Okay, I am so excited to welcome Sara officially. Let me just make sure we can all see you. There you go. Everyone should see her spotlighted. Good and beautiful there. Sara, thank you so much for being with us. Sara is a first-year PhD student in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese Studies at the University of Minnesota. Her work focuses on the culinary heritage and cultural identity of Sephardic Jews. Before coming to the University of Minnesota, she worked as the collaborations manager for the Jewish Arts Collaborative and the associate director for young adult programs at Hebrew College in Boston, Massachusetts. She is an alumna of Tufts University. From 2016 to 2017, Sara lived and researched medieval Sephardic culinary heritage in Spain as a Fulbright graduate research scholar. I think that definitely deserves a little bit of cheer for sure. She has presented her work at various international food studies conferences, including the Oxford Symposium on Food and Cookery and the Dublin Gastronomy Symposium. Sara is also a published cookbook author, and we will make sure that you get a link to buy her cookbook if you would like. It's called the Rosh Hashanah Seder Cookbook, Stories and Recipes from the Reform Jewish Community of Madrid. That is available on Amazon, and again, available on Amazon, and we'll make sure that everyone gets that. Just as we have introduced Sara, please feel free. I see some people are introducing themselves in the chat. Feel free to continue to do so. And, you know, we will be eating at some point, whether you're eating as you cook along or cooking after. So I kind of feel like a preemptive hamotzi might even be appropriate. But nonetheless, let me turn this over to you, Sara. Thank you so much. It truly is an honor for you to be here with us today.
Thank you so much, Rabbi, for that really lovely, warm welcome. I'm so thrilled to be here. I also love what you said about food being Torah. It is so true, even though it doesn't necessarily always look like a scroll. And I hope, you know, some of these 3 sessions together, we'll get to kind of dive into that and see how kind of truly flexible, right, like our concept of Torah is in the Jewish tradition, especially when it comes to food. So I'm so thrilled to be with you all. I love seeing where everybody's coming from in the chat. I just want to say, throw in my location. I'm in Minneapolis, Minnesota, currently. And I am just thrilled to be here. And so I thought I'd kind of just start off with like a little bit of a framing, right? Because we're spending 3 sessions together. This isn't just a one-off session. This is kind of like a triad of, you know, 3 classes that I hope will allow us together to explore the really interesting tapestry that is the Southern Jewish culinary tradition. As the rabbi mentioned, my background is actually in Sephardic culinary heritage and cultural identity. We'll be touching on that a little bit today. But really, I have so much love and so much appreciation for diasporic Jewish food traditions worldwide, because I think it tells us so much about who we are as a global Jewish community. And I will be planting a few questions. We'll be talking about a few areas, but I just want to say by no means it's exhaustive. I'm hoping rather, my intention for this is that it's just sort of like a doorway to explore more, to get you to ask questions, to give you some resources for your own explorations. So we can, individually and as a community kind of continue to create a more vibrant picture of what it means to be Jewish and what it means to cook Jewish and eat Jewish. So that's the big old framing. This class will actually be focusing on the Sephardic Savannah, and we'll get into how that's a little bit more complicated than the title sort of portrays. I do also just want to mention the cookbook that I have published has to do with the Madrid community that I was lucky enough to be a part of when I lived in Spain on a Fulbright. So it's another different, wonderful Jewish community. And I did just want to note that if you do buy that book, all of the proceeds actually go to the Reformed Jewish community of Madrid. So it's like a really nice way if you're looking to support an international Jewish community. It's a great one. And I'll share that link later. Okay. So to start us off, I'm actually the way today is going to go is I'm going to start off with a little bit of history, with a little bit of, really, we're starting off with a couple of activities just to kind of get our thinking caps on in terms of, oh no, I know everybody, I'm so sorry. My camera's not the best on my computer for some reason. I appreciate your patience and flexibility with it.
Sarah, I jumped in to say that I spotlit both you and your cooking table, so that shrinks the picture a little bit, which will make the quality a little bit better. And for those for whom it may be distracting, just go to gallery view and you'll see Sarah smaller, but we can hear you wonderfully. So, and if you're not familiar how to do that, if you're on a computer, in your top right corner, you should have the option to switch between gallery view and speaker view. And that will allow her to be less blurry, but the sound is coming in great. And we know it's her bandwidth, not the lens. We tried that, but thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks, Rabbi, for clarifying and spotlighting. And don't worry, everyone. The food part, the important part, will be clear as day. So that's what we're going for. Okay, so as I was saying, we're just going to start off. Part of this for me, I wanted for us, because we're coming from such different locations, actually to kind of get to know each other a little bit. So I have a couple of questions that we're going to kind of discuss together. And that then will lead into some real history that we'll talk about of, like, why Sephardic, why Savannah, what, like, the big whys, right? The why, the how, the where, the when, all of that good stuff. And then I'm going to demo a couple of recipes that you should have received already. If you haven't, I will reshare the link right now to the class recipe sheet. And you can feel free, this is a Google document. You can feel free to follow along and make a copy. I encourage you to make a copy and annotate for yourself, notes that I say, things you want to remember as I'm cooking, because as we all know, recipes say one thing and sometimes the demo shows something different. So that's the sheet that I will be using. That's the recipe, the two recipes that I will be demoing today. Okay, so that's just a little order. And one last logistical housekeeping item. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. I love questions. Questions are my favorite thing. Please don't be afraid to ask them. And Virginia and Rabbi, if you catch a question that I don't see, please feel free to call it out and I will try to answer it the best that I can. Okay, great. So let's move to our little warm-up. Okay, so hopefully this presentation will be clearer than my face. But I'm just gonna pull it up. If it will load. Okay, here it is. Okay, so as I said today, this is our first of a 3-class series. Next week, we'll be focusing on ostensibly the Ashkenazi Delta, so another kind of area of the South and another part of our grand Jewish diaspora. And then our last class, we're going to talk about Jewish soul food and kind of what that means. And again, all of these titles are the themes of the class, but hopefully we're going to get into them and kind of complicate them a little bit more. So actually right now, what I want us to do, I have 2 questions for you, and I'm going to put them in the chat too. The first question is, what to you is Southern food? Okay. And then the second question is, what is Jewish food? And what I'm going to have us do now, because I want us to kind of get to know each other a little bit, is where I'm going to have Virginia send you out into breakout rooms of about 5 people for about 5 minutes. I want you guys to introduce yourselves, say where you're coming from, your name, and then I want you to talk about these 2 questions. Think about meanings, flavors, ingredients, memories, even, like when we think about matzo ball soup, what do we think about? It's not just the soup, right? So I really want us to kind of dive in and start to pick apart, okay, when we think about Southern food and when we think about Jewish food, what do we think about? How do we define those things to ourselves, okay? So Virginia, I'm gonna ask you to send everybody to a breakout room for 5 minutes. And then when we come back, we'll all discuss it together. Okay, so keep those notes from your conversation.
And don't worry if you've never been in a breakout room before. It's almost like magic. You're going to go into the room and then we'll bring you back. Don't worry about it. Just click join when you get the pop-up on your screen. And you'll be automatically brought back when we close it out.
Okay, people are very slowly populating the rooms, but they're going in.
Yeah, I see that, which is okay. It happens.
I'm happy to go into my room or stay if you have any questions. I see a few people here might not be as familiar, and my friend Estelle, I'm not sure. Estelle, are you there? Might not be as familiar with breakout rooms, so.
Okay. Well, here's what we can do for the folks who are here. We can just kind of start discussing if they're able and willing. All the folks out there, hello. So feel free to just unmute and just start talking or put it in the chat. What does Southern food mean to you? What does Jewish food mean to you?
I see Marion's forehead.
Yes, I see Marion's forehead.
For those of you, if you're trying to unmute yourself, there's a little microphone with a red line on it. If you click on that, that'll let you unmute yourself and speak. And I'm going to go pop into my room, Sarah. Looks like you got this okay, so I'll go join.
Thank you.
You got it. Excuse me.
Virginia, did you see what time everybody went to the breakout room? Oh, you're muted.
I did not check the exact time, but I'm guessing it's been at least 5 minutes that they've been in there.
I think like let's give it like a minute or two, and then
Okay, so close them out and bring them back in.
Yeah, I'll give everybody a 1 minute warning. Give folks a second to return usefully.
Okay, I'm gonna bring them back now.
Great, yeah. Sure.
Okay. I gave it another minute. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no, that's okay. It's okay. Share my screen again. We got folks coming back. Good.
Yep, they're coming back in.
So,
Okay. So we've got folks coming back. This is great. I hope the breakout rooms were nice. Got to meet someone that maybe you don't know super well. So I'm curious to hear, like, in those rooms, what came up? Like when we think of answering that question, what is Southern food? What comes up? And you can feel free to put it in the chat. You can feel free to unmute and say it out loud, and I'll annotate it. But to you all, like, what is Southern food?
well, we talked about Southern food consists of a variety of foods that are eaten in Southern states, which may be of African origin, of origin from anywhere in the world. I talked about, I'm in Florida now, Florida cracker, white Southern Floridians from the old ways to African American soul food. So really a huge variety of foods, Creole food in Louisiana, foods from West Africa in the Carolinas. I mean, we just talked about a variety of foods, and it's really rich and varied.
I love that. That's wonderful. Thank you. Yeah. What else? Any other? I see in the chat fried okra. I see very heavy food with lots of salt and butter. Cajun style, low country. What else? What other ideas? Gumbo. Feel free to just call out if you feel called.
Jambalaya.
Jambalaya, yes. Deep fried hush puppies. Yeah, so we've got these.
Oh, hush puppies. No.
Fried chicken and grits.
Fried chicken and grits. Yeah, grits, biscuits. I know that there's a lot of love for grits in the South. Greens, right, too, collards.
Fried
mac and
anything.
cheese, black-eyed
Fried
peas.
okra.
Fried anything.
Fried everything.
Fried. I love that. Totally. Wow. Yeah, that's
Lots of shellfish.
amazing. Yeah. So like what I'm pulling out here is kind of I'm actually going to take a picture of this. You can take it. What I'm hearing is, you know, the specific foods, right? But we're also seeing like trends, right? There are areas, there are regions, there's like a certain type of flavor, right? Like something spicy, something fried, oil-based, right? There are all these kind of aspects of it. Awesome. So now I want us to think about Jewish food. Same question, but different focus. Like, what does Jewish food mean to you?
Holiday.
Like in chunks with meat.
Holidays, cholent. Love it. What else?
Chopped liver.
Chopped liver. Love it. Classic.
Ashkenazic influence.
Ashkenazic influence. Yeah. So we've got a couple of like, you know, Ashkenazi soul food dishes.
Sephardic foods.
Griebenus, schmaltz.
The other stuff to fry things in. Yeah, I love it. Kugels. I got Nadela in the chat. Love that.
Knishes.
Schnecken.
Schnecken. Okay, we got Schnecken.
Jewish penicillin, chicken soup.
Jewish penicillin, chicken soup. Classic. I love it.
I have
think
to
it
ask if the person who shouted out Schnecken is from Philadelphia.
No.
No? Okay. Okay.
I'm from Savannah.
Okay. Well, I love that.
I love that. And I see latkes, matzo ball soup, kasha, bow ties, kasha varnishkas, right? I grew up with that too.
Knishes.
You know, all of these deli and appetizing. I love it. So we got like this other region, right, of food that we're talking about, bagels. And I love that everybody's like really calling out, especially these very Ashkenazi soul foods, because, you know, as someone who studies Jewish food, one of the things you learn is that there are so many different types of Jewish foods, just like we kind of pointed out with Southern food, that there's so many kind of things encompassed in this one label that's Southern. There's so many things as well encompassed in this label of Jewish. And so that's some of the framing here that I want us to kind of carry with us for the duration of this series, of that, you know, Jewish, Southern, there are these labels that indicate something and they're useful, right? We're talking about a region, we're talking about a community, right? We're talking, hopefully it indicates ingredients, right? But as we'll see kind of throughout these next 3 Sundays, that it's all a little bit more complicated than it seems. So yes, so with that, I kind of wanted to add a little framing here, because I think as a food historian, I find it very helpful when we study food and when we study the meanings of identity related to food, that we kind of have a little bit of theoretical framing here, both because in the academic environment, food is still not considered a very serious area of study for many reasons, but also because it helps us then parse out differences, similarities, and really get to the heart of, you know, what is happening when people are expressing identity through food, right? Because food can look a certain way, it can taste a certain way, but it can communicate all of these meanings that are subtle, that are hard to perceive, and that change. They're not fixed. It depends who's cooking, who's eating, who's watching whom cook and eat, right? So I thought it would be helpful to just kind of lay out here a couple of categories that I'm using for this series to think about, okay, what are we talking about when we talk about Southern food? And what are we talking about when we talk about Jewish food especially? So thinking about Southern food, as you'll see, you got this nice picture of collards, right? Like because in my research, I saw a lot of references to collard greens being very important. So one of the main things, right, is that the South, the American South, is a region, right? It's a historical region. And historians who write about the South, who think about the South, have debated a lot. Okay, so what are those boundaries, right? And so regionally, it's really, a lot of people say, a lot of historians say it's everything south of that Mason-Dixon line, right? So we're talking about states as far north as Virginia and as far south as Florida. So, and we're encompassing in that region many different climates, right? Mostly warm, but you know, some people even include like the Chesapeake Bay area of Maryland in that region. So it's not a fixed thing, but rather kind of an indication of what can be grown there, right? So like we have ingredients that come there, like collards, like peanuts, rice, sugar, tobacco, tobacco not being a food ingredient, but like an important crop, right, of the area, and a sort of warmer climate on the whole, right, than say in the north or here in Minneapolis where it's very, very cold, right? And that brings with it a whole kind of set of eating rituals, of eating habits, and ingredients and dishes. Okay, so we've got the regional aspect, and that tangibly affects in terms of what ingredients are we using, and our, you know, how are we organizing ourselves as a community around food. Then we also have, you know, the South has a very specific, as I'm sure you all know, and a very complicated history in how it has been constructed and become part of the United States. And I think what's really important here to know, especially for this first session, where we'll be talking about the Sephardic Savannah, is this idea of the South is something that, you know, kind of comes later on. So the people who we'll be talking about today didn't necessarily have an idea that they were living in a region that was, you know, the South. That's something that kind of came later, comes after American independence. But places like Georgia, places like Savannah and Charleston were such important ports of trade and were centers of many different interactions among many different communities, whom many of you have brought up, right? African-American communities, African communities, even before they were American, right? We have the indigenous peoples who lived in the South before the arrival of English and German and European colonists. And we have also, you know, the influence of a variety of different communities that have kind of swept through and about the South. And as they've left their kind of vestiges, their culinary vestiges, right? And have been adapted into that culinary repertoire. And then finally we have culture, right? Like culture is this like very kind of sticky term. I think it sort of means everything and nothing at once, but it is important in this case specifically as we're talking about how people express themselves, right? And food, as with art, as with film, as with literature, is a way of expressing a cultural identity, right? It's a way of saying, I belong to this community and this is how I mark myself. And that is as true for Southerners as it is for Jews. And then it's even truer for Southern Jews, as I'm sure many of you who are Southern Jews who are with me can attest to. You know, you have a very specific community and a specific identity that maybe doesn't always fit so comfortably, say, in a Northern American Jewish, Northeastern American Jewish context, or in a traditional Southern context, right? It's sort of this very special hybrid identity that I think is important here. So that's kind of how we're situating our idea about Southern food. Now let's think about Jewish food. Oops. And as you can see, I've got a picture of what comes to mind every time I ask that question, you know, what is Jewish food? Kugel. For a lot of people, it's kugel. And myself, as a very, you know, I'm born and raised Ashkenazi Jewish girl. I fell in love with the Sephardic tradition, which is why it's my research. But my you know, home culinary repertoire is stuff like kugel and brisket and latkes and all of that stuff. For a lot of people, those Ashkenazi foods encompass, you know, what Jewish food is. And so I'm here today as someone, even though I love all of those things, to say, actually, there's a lot more to the story that's a little. So a couple of kind of categories or ideas that I use that I think are helpful when we're talking about Jewish food generally, and especially today when we're talking about Southern Jewish food and the specific kind of special community that it is, are these three things. So, you know, when we're talking about Jewish food, we're talking about a diaspora, right? So we're talking about people after the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem in 70 before the Common Era. A massive dispersion across the whole known world. And so we're talking about, in that dispersion, completely different geographies, completely different cultures, majority cultures, and completely different historical trajectories that have shaped the identities, the Jewish identities, and therefore the culinary expression of all of these communities, right? You're not going to get the same dish in a Moroccan Jewish community as you are, say, in a Southern Jewish community or in a German Jewish community, just by dint of the historic development of that community and the climate, the location, right? Ingredients are important. Can you get the ingredients that you want, say, for a cocoa in a much warmer climate? Generally not, right? So that's kind of something I like to keep in mind. Another thing I like to keep in mind is religious observance, right? Because one of the main kind of cohering elements of Jewish identity, right, is we observe the Jewish religion. Sure, that's a simple statement, but of course it's more complicated, right? Because especially when it comes to food, that observance can be very, very complicated. Kashrut is our system of kind of separating out the acceptable to eat from the not acceptable to eat. But of course, community to community, we have very different kind of notions of like how that actually practically works, right? So that's why, for example, in the state of Israel, there are two head rabbis of the state of Israel, one Sephardic and one Ashkenazi, because those observances are different. And that's important when it comes, again, to food and to the interaction of identity through food. We have textual interpretation. We have, you know, we're a community with a tremendous amount of text. We come with the Tanakh, we come with the Talmud, we come with the Mishnah, right? We have this body of text that is helpful. And like Rabbi said, right, in the Torah, the rabbis talk a lot, or not the Torah, the Talmud, the rabbis talk a lot about food and eating food and sharing food. And so that also kind of is wrapped up in our notion of Jewish food, Jewish eating, Jewish culinary tradition. And then, of course, as so many of you highlighted, I loved, you know, a lot of these foods are holiday foods, right? Or, you know, some of them are everyday foods, like brisket's sort of a special occasion food, but you're maybe not eating that every day, right? So that is kind of wrapped up in that religious observance. And then finally, I think a really important aspect when we're talking about Jewish food is the idea of ethnicity or cultural cohesion. And it works in kind of both ways, where Jews always kind of seem to occupy this place that's within and without, right? Throughout history, throughout time. We're both fully assimilated and not assimilated. We maintain kind of a certain set of differences, you know, why? For various reasons. But what that means in terms of food practice is, you know, the main question, are Jews eating what the majority culture is eating around them, the foods of the majority society, or are they eating something different? And what is this saying about the Jewish community in those places throughout time and place? So, yes, and thank you, Rabbi, for that comment. I love that, the angels. We do focus a lot on food. It's important, right? 3 square meals a day. Very, very critical. Also, I don't know how many of you say this, but in my house growing up, we always used to joke that the major themes of the Jewish holidays is they tried to kill us, they didn't succeed, now let's eat. So yes, food is a really important thing in Jewish tradition and identity. So that's just a little bit of framing that I hope will be a little helpful as we actually get into the history. So today we're focusing on specifically the Sephardic Savannah. And one huge disclaimer that I really want to make before I even jump into this, and hopefully it will become clear as I kind of get into the history a little bit more, is although this session is called Sephardic Savannah, I am by no means saying that only Sephardic Jews are in Savannah, Georgia. Okay, it's a much more complicated history. Throughout this class, we'll be interacting with many different Jewish communities who've come to America in different periods and different times. And so while we're talking about Sephardic Jews mostly, that's just for this session an entryway into this one time period to kind of frame this series. So I just want to say that because, of course, as I've been saying, the diaspora is a really complicated tapestry in its kind of macrocosm, and in the microcosm of the Jewish diaspora in the South, it's so true as well. So we're not here to make generalizations. We're here to witness patterns and think in a complicated way about our food traditions. So who are the Sephardic Jews? A working definition that I use in my academic work, which is and will be different than what some popular belief around what is the Sephardic Jewish community, actually will be different. So from my perspective as someone who studies Sephardic Jews, when I'm talking about Sephardic Jews, I'm specifically talking about the Jews who trace their roots back to the Iberian Peninsula. So that's Spain and that's Portugal. You can see on a map right here, a kind of like old map of both Spain and Portugal. The Sephardic Jews are those Jews that lived in Spain and Portugal and were expelled from there in 1492 and 1495 respectively, and branched out into one of the farthest reaching diasporas, sub-diasporas of the Jewish diaspora. So where do they get that name? I thought this was interesting. I wanted to bring it up. So a lot of rabbinic commentators and members of the Sephardic community believe that actually the name Sephard, which is believed to be Spain, the area where Spain is referenced in the Torah. And it says in Obadiah 120, in verse 20, or verse 20 of chapter 1 of Obadiah, it says, "And this exiled host of the children of Israel who are with the Canaanites as far as Zarephath, and the exile of Jerusalem, which is in Sephard, shall inherit the cities of the Southland." Okay, so that's what most historians and rabbinic scholars believe indicates in the Torah where Spain is, that Spain is Sephard. Okay, I thought it was interesting to bring up also with this session because look, that line, shall inherit the cities of the Southland, right? We're talking about the South, the American South. So I just thought it was an interesting kind of, you know, whoever's into prophecy might read it differently, but like potentially one of the ways of reading this prophecy, right, is not just the Southland, Sephard being Spain or Portugal, but also maybe the American South. So I just thought it was an interesting thing. But so this community of the Sephardic Jews, as I said, lived in and were expelled from Spain in 1492. And before 1492, the Sephardic Jews formed a really important part of the multicultural milieu that was medieval Spain, specifically Andalusia. So that's in the southern part of that map that we just saw. Here, I'll show you. Just indicate it maybe a little bit more. So when we're talking about Andalusia, we're talking about this sort of southernmost region. But at the height of Muslim power in Spain, that region reached up to around here, that sort of 2/3 line at the topmost border of Portugal. Okay, and so Jews were doctors, viziers, lawyers. They were important in Muslim courts of the Caliphate, especially of Cordoba. This is an image from the Mezquita de Cordoba. And then they also were very important in the Christian domains of Spain. And a lot of historians sort of situate the Jewish community either in this really beneficial, wonderful thing called the convivencia, the great living together. I'll type that in the chat, convivencia. Here you go. right? For those of you who know Spanish, con with, vive, living, right? The great living together. And then there are others who kind of situate it more negatively, that Jews were deeply mistreated as part of, as a minor religious community caught between the battling of the more demographically dominant Muslim and Christian community, right? So different historians say different things about this. The truth is always, of course, somewhere in between. But what we do know about the Sephardic Jews is that they were a really important aspect of medieval Spanish society, medieval Spanish economy. They were some of the most important merchants. And they were an incredibly learned and prestigious class of Jews, to the difference of other global Jewish communities at a similar time. And that sort of idea of prestige is something that will be carried with them kind of throughout their existence. And it's a very important kind of cultural point. So, and here I had a picture of the diaspora, just to give you a sense of, when 1492 comes, the year 1492 is kind of an infamous year, as we know, because incidentally, right, Christopher Columbus, we have Columbus Day coming up on Monday. 1492, the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabel, they conquer the last Muslim stronghold of the Iberian Peninsula, Granada, in January. In March, they issue the Edict of Expulsion of the Jews from Spain. And then that exit date is actually August of 1492, 3 days, incidentally, before Christopher Columbus is supposed to sail for the New World. So there's a tremendous amount happening in this time. The Inquisition has been created just a few years before, in 1478, by Ferdinand and Isabel to root out the sort of problematic idea of Judaizing. So, this expulsion of the Jews from Spain comes as this next step in ridding their project of Castilianizing and Christianizing Spain and uniting it under one crown, under one religion, and then, of course, under one kind of cultural, ethnic community as well. Things happen a little bit slower in Portugal, but it's related, right? Because the king of Portugal was actually the son, or not the son, he was a close relative of Isabel. And so he felt a deep amount of pressure to work with Ferdinand and Isabel so that he could actually marry their daughter. So in 1495, we have the expulsion of the Jews from Portugal. So I highlight this and I show this image just to show the huge dispersion of people. And we can actually see, I'm going to highlight a line for you all. So we see this map. We see, okay, there's an arrow going to Lisbon. There's an arrow from Lisbon to Amsterdam. There's an arrow from Amsterdam to London. And then an arrow from Amsterdam/London down to Recife. And really there should be another arrow that goes from Recife to New Amsterdam, okay? So that's kind of the trajectory we're following, which is part of what's called the Western Sephardic diaspora, okay? And that's specifically focusing on Portuguese Sephardic Jews who followed a slightly different path than their Spanish brethren, co-religionists. And part of that path was that many of the Jews in Portugal had been forcibly converted or voluntarily converted to Catholicism. And part of that was because of the Inquisition, which I just previously mentioned. The Inquisition sought to root out any influence that it saw of those who were quote unquote Judaizing or engaging in Jewish behaviors, who were potentially by that same coin influencing their neighbors who had already converted to Catholicism to engage in Jewish behaviors and thereby undermining their baptisms and their conversions, right? And so this was an idea of the Spanish and Portuguese crown that anyone who's engaging in these quote unquote Jewish behaviors, and a lot of those behaviors included food and food practices, right? Kashrut and all of that stuff, then their conversion to Catholicism would would not hold as true. And so the price in many regions of Spain and Portugal up until the mid 19th century, actually, the last trial of the Inquisition was in 1836. And the Inquisition, at least in Spain, was not formally disbanded and struck from the Spanish Book of Record until 1967. So we have an institution that begins in 1478 and goes all the way until 1967. So the punishment for Judaizing was being burned at the stake, and this is an image of that in Portugal in one of the main plazas, which is known by some as like the plaza at the end of the world, right near it by in Lisbon. That's where a lot of major ships left port for the New World. So for the burgeoning colonies in the Caribbean, in South America, and America, what you know as the United States now. So this gives us kind of a very short, very condensed a short condensed version of a very complicated history of this group of people who come from Portugal, who are forcibly converted or voluntarily convert to Catholicism, who then make their way because of this persecution to Amsterdam, and then a part of that community reconverts to Judaism and then makes its way to London. And so that puts us sort of, right around the time that we'll be talking about very shortly. So, which is the early 18th century. So that's the history of like the Portuguese nação, the nation, as they kind of called themselves, this group of Sephardic Jews from Portugal who reconverted to Judaism and then were found in many locations outside of Portugal after 1495. But we also have like a deep Sephardic history in America already. And so one of the kind of first Jewish feet on American soil is actually a group of Sephardic Jews who were redirected, as I had mentioned, right in that arrow that we saw on the dispersion map, from Recife, Brazil. So I just want to go back so we can see that again, where Recife is. So here's Recife, right? And so what happens, all of the history of these colonies is kind of caught up in all of the conflict, the inter-European conflict that's happening right now, or at the time, between Spain, Portugal, between France, England, all of these different wars to gain access to the New World, to own the New World as colonies, and thereby the resources that are in the colonies, right? And so it takes this inter-European fight Atlantic, right? It spans the whole world. And so at the time that these Sephardic Jews arrive in Recife, it is actually a Dutch port. And why is that important? Because in Dutch colonies, as in Amsterdam, right after the Great Schism, there is a tolerance for religious difference, right? So again, we're dealing with a community that is primarily Jewish, right? Primarily a religious community. What happened in Amsterdam is that the Calvinist Protestant religion becomes part of the accepted religion, which up until that point was Catholicism. But what that means is because in these Dutch colonies, they accept a non-quote unquote Catholic religion, they're also accepting Jews. Jews are allowed to be there and to freely practice, although on the condition that they be quote unquote quiet. It's a word used many times in epistolary correspondences between Jewish communities who are trying to settle in the New World and the European governments who run those colonies. All right, so at the time, Recife, right, in 1642 is a Dutch colony. But then because of a variety of conflicts across the Caribbean, it goes into Portuguese control. And why is this important? Because once a colony switches to Portuguese control, then it is technically a colony in which the Inquisition is functioning. And so what do the Sephardic Jews do? They are given, of Recife, they are given an opportunity to go back to Amsterdam or to stay and to reconvert again to Catholicism and to stay there. About enough people to fill about 16 ships decide to go back to Amsterdam, where they can rejoin the Amsterdam Sephardic community, which again is that Portuguese community. But what happens? Okay, so this flotilla of 16 ships goes off in 1652, and one of them kind of gets either the direction, we're not really sure what happened, but instead of ending up in the Amsterdam port, they end up in New Amsterdam. Okay, so which we now know as New York. So the first Jewish people in America are Sephardic Jews. Obviously, the colony of New Amsterdam later falls under British control and becomes New York. And we know now that it is, New York, the Big Apple. But I always think this is an interesting historical fact just to talk about because, right, like when we think about New York Jewish, we think about Ashkenazi food, right? But really, we're talking about a Sephardic community coming from this very specific place in the world. Okay, but how does that relate to the South? So yes, and Barbara, yes, Emma Lazarus was descended from those Portuguese Jews. Yes, and the Jewish parts of the Caribbean. I love this. I'm just keeping an eye on the chat because I love what I'm seeing here. Yes, amazing. So moving from New York down to the South, right? When do we really have like our first kind of major indication of Jewish presence in Savannah specifically? I'm not going to say the South, but I'm going to say Savannah because this is a very important, this is a starting point of our series, and it's sort of regarded by many historians as kind of the starting point of like the quote unquote Jewish South, but I'm not going to say that it's the first Jews who come to the South. There are others, but the first kind of really notable Jewish presence for our purposes comes in July 11th, 1733. A group of those Jews, of those Portuguese Jews from London arrive thanks to the help of James Edward Oglethorpe, who was a British lord in charge of the colony of Georgia. They ask him to allow them to settle in his colony, and he says yes. And what happens? This group of 42 people, both Portuguese and German Jewish, okay? And here's where it gets complicated, right? Again, going back to that disclaimer, we're not talking just about Sephardic Jews here, we're talking about German Jews, but I'll get into that later because there's some interesting aspects to that that we can plant some questions and you all can tell me what you think, but I have a take on it that I'm going to offer. So this flotilla of 48 or 42 Jews come from London to Savannah, Georgia. They arrive in Savannah, Georgia. They're penniless. They're seeking refuge, religious refuge, and they are ready to settle and begin their lives in America, which is different than other Jewish settlers who have come through at different previous moments. That historians like Jonathan Sarna kind of note that this group of people was just a little different because they really came to the United States meaning to stay and meaning to settle there and to have a Jewish community in the area where they arrived. So of those 42 people, all but 8 are Portuguese Sephardic Jews. The other 8 are Jews of German descent. And why is that important? It's kind of a relationship throughout time between German Jews and Sephardic Jews, right? Not Ashkenazi, but German, okay? Great. And so a lot of these people actually attended a synagogue in London called the Bevis Mark Synagogue. I'm not sure if anybody's been to London, but if you have been, yes, Naomi and Edwin, I see you waving. If you haven't been, make sure to go see the synagogue. It's very interesting. And this group of Jews then from that community come to Savannah. And the first thing they do, it's kind of an interesting thing, given the development of other previous Jewish communities in other cities, and also later on as well. What do? The first thing they do is they try to form a congregation called Mikveh Israel, which is, I'm hoping that there are some Mikveh Israel folks in the audience, and I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly to you all, knowing that you might be out there in Savannah. And why is this different? This does not have to do with food, but I think this context is helpful for us to think about. They set up a congregation first, and then a mikveh, right, a ritual bath, and then a cemetery. Okay. It's different because traditionally in other Jewish cities, including Charleston, Philadelphia, Newport, Rhode Island, a couple of those are, important Sephardic communities as well. They set up the cemetery first. Cemetery, then mikveh, then lastly the congregation. And I actually kind of want to throw it out to you all, just like quickly, feel free to respond in chat. Thank you, Herbert. I'm glad that I pronounced Mikveh Israel correctly. I'd love to get your opinions in the chat of like, why is it rare and potentially interesting that this group of Jews sets up a congregation first and a cemetery last? Or to flip the question, why is it important that other groups of settling colonial Jews set up a cemetery first and then a congregation last? I'm just curious what everybody thinks about that. You can also feel free to call it out. If you haven't.
Expectation of being dispersed again.
Right, like there's this idea, right? If you're setting up a community, there's not going to be dispersion. Totally. I see Sierra, maybe because it's time sensitive to bury someone. Correct? Yeah, totally. Depending on the average age of the congregants, right? I love that logistical thinking, Barbara. Totally. Why else? I'm just curious. I have my ideas, but I'm curious. Mikveh is about future impermanence. I love that, Rabbi.
The South was in the midst of a plague, and one of the passengers on that ship was a physician, and he was specifically invited to that area to help with the plague. And I think, and given that it was a plague area, it was a natural thing to want to be buried as a Jew in a cemetery.
But they did the synagogue first.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Theo. Yeah, the synagogue was created first.
But they did I think they wanted to feel that they were really settling as a community. And this was the sign of the community.
Totally. I love that. I love all of these answers. I think they're all right in a way. Like, I think the need to bury someone, right, and bury someone quickly is really important. But again, right, like in Savannah, it's the congregation first. And I think it can be read many ways, just as Naomi said, of like creating a community, a permanent community. I think there's a real impetus to life with that, saying that we're going to be here, we're going to stay here, and that this communal life is important. I think also when we think about rabbinically what the rabbis thought was important in terms of setting up a community, it's kind of an interesting order, because again, to them, setting up a community, it's a cemetery and it's a mikveh before a place to pray in a lot of cases. And one of the points of this, that why I'm bringing this up, why I think it's important, they did arrive with a Torah scroll. Herbert, yes, exactly. A Sephard Torah, as it was called in, Ladino Judeo-Spanish of the moment. The reason that I believe that this is such an interesting fact is because the people who came from London, these Portuguese Jews, had already been through this really challenging period of having to convert to Catholicism, either by forced choice or forcibly, right? Sometimes a choice isn't fully voluntary when there's so much pressure to become a religion, right? And they had then reconverted. And in the time that it took to reconvert, it wasn't something that happened immediately. It would often be between generations, right? So it was children of people who had been forcibly converted to Catholicism and then were secretly keeping Judaism would then ostensibly reconvert to Judaism externally. And so there's like a certain amount, we could say, of loss of knowledge of Jewish practice there. But a read that I like, that I think is a little bit more constructive and positive, that I think is true of the Sephardic diaspora generally and of crypto-Jewish and Portuguese Jewish history as a whole, is that there was a lot more flexibility in terms of the ritual observances, of the religious observances of this particular group of people. And it's actually something that will be commented on later that I'll explain. But I think that's important. So they're kind of redoing the order of what the rabbis lay out, and of what other communities who may have been more kind of ostensibly learned in the textual tradition of Judaism, even though they brought a Torah, we're dealing with a group of people who had kind of had some generational loss of Jewish liturgical textual knowledge. And we see that in the establishment of this community. Another really interesting thing, I want to kind of show you these two. I haven't been to Mikveh Israel, and I would love to go, especially after doing this research. And I hope to make it out there one day, but I just thought this kind of side-by-side comparison was really neat. So this first picture, that's the inside of the Bevis Marks synagogue. Okay, and in the moment that these Jews came to America, the London Portuguese Sephardic community was one of the most influential, globally influential Jewish communities of the time. And so we see that. You see this kind of luscious, wonderful interior of the synagogue. And then we see the inside of Mikveh Israel, which is also like this just beautiful Gothic, gorgeous stained glass. It's a beautiful synagogue. They're oriented maybe in somewhat similar ways, somewhat different ways, right? The pews here are kind of facing each other. The pews here are facing forward in a more kind of high German tradition, right? Showing the influence of non-Sephardic heritage. But then also on the outside, I think this is really funny, or not funny, interesting. So the Bevis Marks synagogue was what was known as one of those hidden synagogues. It was kind of a clandestine thing. It was important for the Jewish community to kind of hide a little bit, because although this was one of the most prominent Sephardic and Jewish communities at the time, they were also experiencing a tremendous amount of persecution, and it wasn't exactly a safe thing to be a Jew at this time, especially in England. But I think this is so cool, right? You then see an image of Mikveh Israel, which I'm sorry, it's a little blurry, but I just thought it was such a good shot of the whole synagogue. This is like a community that is ready to show itself off, right? We're not hiding. We're not saying that we're gonna, be quiet. And so again, like a lot of these Jewish communities, when they were setting up in the colonies, and especially the Savannah Jewish community, petitioned directly to people like James Oglethorpe and asked via letter, could we come and be here? And practice here, and publicly practice too, which in the moment was a pretty big ask. And this Savannah Jewish community, as with many others, was told, yes, you can come here. Economically, it was such an important thing for these early American colonists from England and from Germany and from other European locations to have a Jewish community there called Port Jews, who lived in port cities, brought with them their familial and economic connections through commerce. They were important economically, but in terms of actual outward religious practice, it was requested that they keep, quote unquote, quiet, so that they don't really show that they're Jewish or that there's any sort of difference among them and the other community members who might have been there. Okay, so that's just a little bit about the synagogue. I wanted to actually kind of also talk about, before we get into the food, right? Because we're here for the food, and I should finish this up soon because I do want to get to demoing. I want to talk specifically about this very important family who it seems like some of you may already know. Oh, I love that there's already someone who's a pork Jew. That's so cool. So I want to talk about this family of Jews who came over with that doctor who Edwin mentioned. The doctor was named Samuel Nunez Ribeiro, and he was a Portuguese doctor. He actually had been taken in himself by the Inquisition for, quote unquote, successfully reconverting Jews. So the Inquisition was really after him, but he was also a doctor, a very important community member. Another really notable figure in this group of Jews who come to Savannah in 1733 is a man named Benjamin Sheftall. And so maybe you can tell by the name, but he was not a Sephardic Jew. He was a German Jew. And why is this important? Well, in some ways, it's really not important. He was a founding member of the Savannah Jewish community that then followed a Portuguese practice. He himself kind of took on Portuguese practice versus a German practice, which liturgically, food-wise, also it's a little bit different. But he really took on, as the leader of this community, this idea of like the Portuguese nation, right? Like the Portuguese nation, this cohering identity. And he was really important. He was one of the founding members. Because of his kind of cohering influence, the community of Mikveh Israel was allowed to get their synagogue. And he is also really interesting because his wife, Perla, is also very interesting, and interesting in a food way, which I'll explain later. And he was, because of his German ancestry, was also in touch with the kind of burgeoning German Prussian community of immigrants to the Georgia colony as well at this time. And so we have this really interesting image, right, of this Jewish community that's getting its start, it's establishing itself as a Jewish community, and it's interacting with non-Jewish communities. It has a very kind of overtly Portuguese Sephardic flavor, pun not intended, in terms of its practice and its ritual organization. But again, we saw Mikveh Israel, those pews are facing the front of the building. Why is that important? Because that means that that synagogue was actually following High German practice. And there we can see kind of physically the real mark of Sheftall, of Benjamin Sheftall, and his German ancestry. Another important person is his son Mordechai, who is written about by many historians as an enthusiastic capitalist. He was incredibly involved in the trade of the port of Savannah, and he also ended up fighting in the Revolutionary War. He was taken actually to, I'm forgetting the actual colony at this present moment. I think it was Antigua, but he was taken as a prisoner of war to Antigua, actually with his son Levi, I believe. And so we actually have Jews here in this quote unquote Sephardic Savannah context, right? Who are not Sephardic themselves, but take on the mantle of, Sephardic Portuguese practice and are really deeply involved in the shaping of our nascent nation of America, which I think is very, very cool. Okay, so that's just a little bit. And what we also have, thanks to Benjamin Sheftall, he kept a meticulous diary in Hebrew. And he actually, because of that, we know all of the people who came through and ended up settling in Savannah and made up this really kind of vibrant tapestry of Jewish life in the pre-revolutionary and revolutionary Savannah. Right, happening before the Revolutionary War. Yes, Levi. Oh, sorry, Marjorie. Thank you for correcting me. His son was Sheftall. Sheftall. Levi was his half-brother. That's correct. Sorry. A lot of names. So here are, all of these very cool people who are coming in, and with them, they're bringing their Portuguese culture, right? Portuguese influence, and of course, Portuguese food. And so what about the food? So what does this mean culinarily, right? So at the time, we have these Portuguese Jews who have lived in London for a long time, congregating with Benjamin Sheftall, who's a German Jew. We have the colony of Georgia, which is both a port colony and it's a plantation economy, right? So we're getting different kind of ingredients and foods from different areas. So some of the records that we have, not solely from the Sephardic community in Savannah, but actually a lot of the record we have comes from some Salzburg immigrants to Savannah around the same time in the 1730s. And they kept diaries as well. And some of the foods that they list that they were eating that were widely available included cucumbers, cabbage, sugar peas, beans, carrots, corn, pumpkin, potatoes, turnips, squash, a specific type of squash called seguata, which you might know as chayote, rice, indigo, which is not a food, but it's a crop, sugar, and then we had dumplings and cornbread. So that's like a very kind of vast amount of different foods that are available. And Benjamin Sheftall and his family, as well as the majority of those 42 people who came from London, although they were, quote unquote, they're perceived as penniless by Jonathan Sarna, Benjamin Sheftall and Mordecai did manage to amass enough wealth to become a very kind of socially and economically prominent family. And so, of course, they had the benefit of being wealthy to afford certain ingredients like sugar, which were a higher cost commodity at the time. Yes, and Melissa, I'm seeing you. Oh my God, you know. Okay, so I had mentioned this before. So why is Perla Sheftall important, and it's important to this class? Well, thanks to Perla and thanks to a letter sent from Reverend Boltzius, who was a Protestant German bishop in Georgia, who was helping to kind of house these Salzburger exiles, who then went to the house of Benjamin Sheftall. In a lot of these historical accounts, it says that they were fed, these Salzburger non-Jewish, they were Protestant immigrants, were housed by Sheftall for a brief time, welcomed to his house, and Perla served them for breakfast something called a good rice soup. Okay, interesting. Why a good rice soup? It's such a generic thing. Like who would kind of think about it? But actually, rice and rice soup, and specifically this thing that's known in the Sephardic diaspora in Turkey as sütlaç or sütlach, depending on who you're talking to, which is a soup made from rice flour and almond milk or just regular milk, depending on if you want it carved or not. That is something that's regularly eaten. And so even though a lot of these historians record this episode and they say she served these immigrants a soup, a good rice soup, without kind of explaining it, it has a tremendous amount of significance because it kind of locates her in relationship with this Sephardic culinary tradition that we're talking about, even though she herself, as with her husband, were of German descent. And just a sort of other historical note here is that there, especially in the 18th century, there becomes a tremendous amount of affinity between German Jews and Sephardic Jews, who the German Jews looked to the Sephardic Jews and those exiles from Spain and Portugal as kind of a more prestigious class of Jews because of their literary and philosophical output in the Spanish Jewish Golden Age of the 11th and 12th centuries. And all of those pieces of text become really important to what happens later on in the 18th century and 19th century in Germany called the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, right? So there's actually this kind of really deep connection between German Jewish, not Ashkenazi Jewish, German Jewish identity and culture and religion and religious observance and Sephardic observance, which I think is interesting. So this is totally a historical projection on my part, but I have a sneaking suspicion that the rice soup that Perla Sheftall was making looked a lot like the sütlaç that her Sephardic neighbors were making as well. And of course, rice being one of the major crops of the American South at the time, it's readily available. And then, of course, it becomes this canvas through which we can see different exhibits of wealth, sugar, seasonings, spices, cinnamon, cardamom, nutmeg, clove, all of these high value items that kind of express a place in society. Okay, so with that, then we're actually going to segue, because it is definitely time to segue to the cooking demo. We are actually going to be making this rice soup today together. And we're also going to be making something called a bulema or a bollo in honor of the Sephardic heritage of the Savannah Jewish community. And this is a dish, the bollo, or it's also called a bulema in some parts. A bulema is a sort of larger bollo. It's a pastry made with Filo dough. Sometimes it's an oil-based pastry that is rolled up over a filling and coiled into these neat little coils that you can see. And so I picked this recipe. We're going to be making one with squash today in honor of that ingredient list that I read to you, and also in honor of the fact that this was a very kind of predominant thing eaten by Portuguese Sephardic communities in Amsterdam, in Curacao, in all of the places that they found themselves, in London as well. So even though it's not something that's explicitly stated as a bollo or a bulema, I think there's a lot of affinity here, and I thought it was also a really great recipe to show you off. So that's what we're going to do today, and I'm going to kind of take you through these recipes now. And before I do that, I'm just going to take a pause here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm just going to say this is a very unexpected time, but I just moved about 6 weeks ago to Minneapolis, and my kitchen equipment has not arrived yet. All of my belongings have not fully arrived. So this is going to be a very equipment light, both of these recipes, which hopefully will actually be helpful because it will be very kind of similar to the way a colonial kitchen worked. There's not so much equipment, but also to kind of empower you all to know that you can make these recipes without as much equipment as you think you might need. So I just wanted to say that my apologies that my movers haven't arrived, but hopefully we can still make it through this recipe and you can get a really good idea of how these work. So I'll be walking you through them. Great. So I'm gonna pause here for a minute. In the meantime, if you have questions as I'm getting set up, feel free to put them in the chat. And then let's get started. There you all are. Wonderful. Okay. Great. So you can see my hands here in the camera, hopefully, which is great. In terms of the question I'm seeing in the chat, also on the recipe sheet, I've given you two fillings. I've given you a cheese filling, which is also a great thing to have just in your back pocket, and a squash filling. I'll just be making the squash filling. Spinach is also traditional. I felt like the squash was just right for the season and just right for the content of this lesson, though. So goat cheese does work, Linda. And of course, as you go, if you have questions, please feel free to shoot them in the chat, and I will show you. Okay, so here we go. First, we're gonna make our phyllo dough. So I have some ready-made phyllo dough here that I already made. Phyllo dough is kind of this magical thing that I think is really wonderful, that is very impressive to show people that you've made. So, and it's deceptively easy. So here's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna measure out 4 cups of bread flour. I use King Arthur bread flour. Why are we using bread flour? Bread flour is a high protein flour. Why is protein important here? We want to get very thin sheets that stretch out very long and thin and evenly. And when we use a high protein flour, that's the quality. Linda, I love it. I'm a big King Arthur fan myself. That's the quality that we're going for when we're making something like a phyllo dough. So just connecting this dough actually to the Sephardic history that we are kind of talking about, that's not so specific to Savannah, but I think is an important kind of thing to remember when we're talking about Jewish food tradition, is that dough cookery was a very important quality of the Sephardic, is a very important quality of the Sephardic tradition. Why is that? Some food historians actually trace it back to the Islamic heritage of the Iberian Peninsula. A lot of the foods that come through from the Sephardic tradition have a very deep background in ancient Persian and medieval Islamic cuisine. And in Andalusia, which was one of the major courts of an Islamic caliphate at the time, dough cookery was really important. You'd wrap things, hide things, put kind of delicacies within these packages that people would then be able to open and enjoy, in accordance actually, coincidentally, with Islamic law. Okay, wonderful. So we've got, oops, sorry. So we've got our flour in there. It's 4 cups. And then I'm gonna put kosher salt. A trick that I think is really cool that not everybody knows, but if you kind of make a little cup with your hand, this area right here on just about everyone is just about a half a teaspoon. And so, for example, when your movers don't come and you don't have all of your kitchen equipment, you can use your hand instead of a spoon. So this is about a half teaspoon of salt. I'm gonna put in 2 of these. I need a full teaspoon, okay? So I've got my salt, and that's wonderful. So I'm just gonna mix that up. I'm gonna break up any chunks in my flour because we want a nice smooth dough. And I'm going to add to this a cup and a third of tepid water and a 1/4 cup of olive oil. So I'm gonna get my tepid water. And the details here are important, okay? What do we mean when we say tepid? We mean a water that we can feel is just slightly warm. Our finger registers both that it is cold and warm at once. It's a very kind of strange sensation, but if you actually kind of put your finger in the water, you can feel it. It's just the hint, the suggestion that it's warm, okay? And then we're gonna put in a 1/4 cup of olive oil. And here you can substitute any oil that you want. You can use sunflower oil, which would be also traditional to the Sephardic tradition and to Savannah tradition. You can substitute vegetable oil as well. If you want different flavors, you could do like avocado seed oil. That's a sort of more modern intervention, and that would be great. So, oops, what I'm gonna do here is I'm just gonna mix this up in a bowl. Hopefully I won't knock over my camera, but I'm just sort of gently incorporating this liquid into this flour. Oops, maybe a little bit too enthusiastically. My camera wants to fall over. And I'm just kind of gently incorporating it until I see, look, it's starting to kind of come together, which is great. Again, camera, oops.
Sarah, I think that Carol, did you have a question? I saw your hand go up. If you'll unmute yourself.
Yeah, if you have a question, please feel free to call out.
I did not have a question. My iPad seemed to just miraculously decide I was raising my hand.
Okay.
Jesus, love that. Well, okay, so no question, but still delighted to have you here.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So, okay, so I'm just kind of now gathering these shaggy pieces into my dough with my hands. And it looks very dry right now, I know. But the thing that's gonna happen here as we work this dough is that all of this dry stuff is gonna slowly become incorporated. And I'm trying to do this so I don't quite knock over my camera, so you can see. I'm learning along with you all as this is a new kitchen setup for me, just slightly different than the kitchen setup I have used before. So I appreciate your patience and flexibility working along with me. Okay, so we have a mostly gathered ball of dough, right? And here's where the real magic is gonna happen. We're just gonna put it on the counter without any flour on it, because this is a pretty floury dough already. We don't need more flour. And I'm actually gonna move this here. Hopefully you can still see. Oop, nope. We're gonna lose the camera. Sorry about that. Okay, let's see.
Sara, we knew it was coming. You prepared us for it. It was just like, when was it going to come? And we all should have taken bets, but we knew it was coming.
I know. I appreciate my mom always jokes with me that she feels seasick sometimes when I hold the camera. So my apologies if I'm making any of you seasick. Okay, here's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna put you here so that I want to get a very kind of firm purchase here, because what's going to happen now is I'm going to knead this dough. Okay, so I just like to, when I knead, I'm using the heel of my hand as a conduit for the strength, not from my arm, but actually from my legs and my core. Okay, so all of the force of this knead is actually coming from me being rooted into the ground. And I'm just going to push across my body one way and kind of spread the dough with me, and then I'm going to take my fingers and kind of pull it back. Okay, and I'm going to do it the opposite way with my left hand. So pulling with that heel of the hand, and then I'm going to curl it back. Okay, and I'm just going to kind of do this alternating, and I'm going to do this for 10 minutes. So I'm not going to do it for the full 10 minutes because we're running low on time, and I want to make sure to get through our other recipes, but I just kind of want to show you how this starts shaping up. So notice, I've got no flour here. This is a flourless surface, and it shouldn't adhere, even at this point, to your surface, okay? You shouldn't need to add extra flour, because if you do, it will become a very stiff dough. We're looking for an elastic dough. We're not looking for a stiff dough. That will enable us to have a really nice stretch on our filo when we finally make those gulamas. So you'll notice that there are like shaggy bits that might kind of fall off, but you can already start to see, right? Like this ball of dough is coming together quite nicely. So just gonna kind of keep doing this. And again, all of the strength of this knead is coming from not my arms, not my wrists. They're just a conduit for my legs and my core. So you can see I'm kind of rocking along with it. This is an excellent basic way of kneading. If you, like I, don't have a dough hook, you can always take the easy route, use a machine with a dough hook. Does count as a workout, Rabbi. It's like getting your steps in. But this is, I think, a really great basic skill to have. That also helps you understand what was happening in the medieval and like earlier periods when people are making doughs that are just this thin, that are just this stretchable and pliable, and they're doing it by hand. They don't have equipment like we have today. So I'm just gonna knead this for a few more minutes because I just kind of want to show you. So we see it's sort of getting worked out. What's happening here on a molecular level is that this is where the gluten structure, I don't know if I have any Great British Bake Off fans in the audience, but the gluten structure is the chain of proteins that gives baked goods their texture. So when you like chew into something, you bite into something, what makes something chewy versus crunchy versus light and fluffy. So this is making our dough very, very chewy if we were to bite into it. And why is that important? Because that means we can stretch out this filo into like a beautiful, lovely, thin sheet for our gulema and our bollo. Cool. So, and yes, this is something that everybody can do. If they have the time and the energy, of course, right? It is a workout. But this is, you don't need a lot of equipment for this, luckily. but I think it's a testament to, you know, what early cooks do and did that we can also do in our kitchens. Sort of like historic baking. Okay, so I'm just gonna stop here and give you like a little look at this. So it's not fully elastic yet, but I want to show this to you. It's still a little sticky. It's not really coming together. I'm gonna poke it. So we can really see that indent, right, in the dough right there. I put a nice hole in that. So we don't want that. How do we know when this dough is ready? When we put a finger into it and it'll start to bounce back on itself. I'm gonna show you. So this is the dough that I prepared before this class by the magic of television, right? I'm gonna poke it and it bounces back. Again, you can see the dent, but almost immediately it kind of has a give that springs back. That's how we know that this dough is ready. Another way to test it is to actually kind of stretch it and see how transparent you can get this dough. So you can like see my fingers in it, right? That means that dough is ready for stretching. Cool. So we're gonna just actually leave this guy to the side for now. And I'm going to move on actually to our filling, right? Because we only have about 20 minutes. And I wanna make sure we've got all of the stuff we need for this dilemma. Okay, so if I were in a kitchen with a lot of equipment, I would have a bench scraper. I don't have a bench scraper. It's a very useful tool when you're working with dough, highly recommend it. And instead I'm using a knife. I'm just gonna cut this ball of dough into eighths. So actually I'm just gonna take quarter, an eighth, quarter and an eighth. Okay, so we got 4, great. And now let's put those over here. I like to kind of shape them into balls before I roll them out, right? So we're just gonna put our dough balls here. 2, 3, 4, okay, great. And this part that I'm not using right now, I'm actually gonna wrap up in plastic wrap. So as you're making these at home on your own, I'm going to always make sure that they are fully covered so that they don't dry out, because dry dough means that you won't be able to stretch it as far and as nicely. Great. So we're just gonna let it hang out with it. Okay, wonderful. So we have our dough balls. I also, before this class, I took the liberty of roasting some squash. So I've got some squash here. This is delicata squash. I just cut it into small pieces. I roasted it at 350 with some olive oil, salt, and pepper for about 45 minutes. And it's really soft and squishy, which is great. And also, I like this. If you don't like this, you don't have to do this, but it's kind of a nice flavor aspect, I think. I like to kind of get it a little crispy, a little burnt, because it makes it kind of more interesting. And so I'm just gonna actually squash this squash with a fork for my filling. And it can be as, you know, thick or not thick as you want it to be. I'm gonna take out some pieces that are a little bit thicker. Actually, you know, again, I'm working with limited kitchen capacity here. I'm so sorry, but hopefully I'm empowering you to be fearless and to not just rely on the usual kitchen tools that you use. So I'm just using a fork here. If I had a masher, I would probably use a masher. But you can do a surprising amount with very little. So I'm just gonna squash the squash. I'm gonna mash it until it's just, you know, good consistency. I actually, when I make this and I do have equipment, I still keep some chunks in it because I think it's a nice textural thing. You can also take out, as I'm doing, those pieces that are a little bit too chunky, right?
So Sarah, a couple comments that are coming in as you're squashing the squash, which I love saying, and I will now make that a thing.
Yes.
Some people had said that they would that they use the, let's see who said this. 1 second. Said that they use the food processor for this part.
Yeah.
So it's nice to know that other people have tried this. I'm very excited. And then we also were asked, do you leave the skin on for the squash?
No. So before you roast it, peel it, chop it up into chunks, small chunks, and then you toss it with olive oil, salt, and pepper. Put it on a baking sheet at 350 for about 45 minutes, depending on how effective your oven is. Okay, so I've got my squash. I'm actually going to add, because why not, a little bit of butter. But if you don't want to add dairy to this, if you want to keep it carb, you can actually just add a little bit of vegetable oil, just a touch, or olive oil again, if you like that flavor, that sort of savory flavor, you can add that here as well. Again, it's your party. I'm just giving you some ideas, but you know, choose your own adventure. And then I'm also going to add an egg into this filling. And I'm going to use maple syrup because I love the flavor of it, just like a little bit, maybe like a tablespoon here for this amount of squash. Just a little bit of sweet, nothing too crazy. You can also put brown sugar here, would be delicious. You can also, if you want, it's not traditional, but you can add orange zest, you can add vanilla extract, you can make it sort of like a sweet potato pie filling and actually use sweet potatoes or yams instead of squash. What we're making right now is called a bulema or a bollo de calabaza. Calabaza is the Judeo-Spanish word for squash or pumpkin. So you can use squash, you can use pumpkin. I'm using a delicata squash, but I've also done this with sweet potato and it's delicious. So I'm just mixing this all up into this lovely little filling, and then we'll get ready to roll these balls out. But actually, so before that, because we're running tight on time, and I do want to make this rice soup with you guys because I think this recipe is so cool. I'm actually going to turn us over to my stove. You'll see my charging cable. I've got a nice big pot here. And in it, I'm going to put 3/4 of a cup of rice flour. And I'm going to just measure that. Also a fun tip, you don't actually need to use just a dry measuring cup. You can use a liquid measuring cup, as I am, to weigh out your ingredients, because we actually, American measuring cups are by volume, not by weight. So it will be the same amount. It just depends on the heaviness of your pour. And then I'm going to put in a nice pinch of salt. And then just want to make sure I've got this quantity right before I quote you. I believe it's about a 1/4 of a cup of sugar, but I just want to make sure on my recipe sheet. Sometimes I forget my amounts as well.
It says 1/2 cup on the sheet.
1/2 cup. Okay. Thank you for calling that out. Well, so I'm going to do a 1/2 cup then. But again, I guess if I were making this just for myself, the way I would do it is I would actually adjust the amount of sugar depending on what you want. It's a very flexible recipe. So you can use a 1/4 cup, you could use a 1/2 cup. You could make it very, very sweet and do 3/4 of a cup of sugar. Whatever, it's your party. You can do what you want. So I've got those things in the bottom of my pan. I'm just gonna kind of scoop it around with my hand. You can also use a spoon. I kind of like to feel it, and you can actually feel that the sugar is a little bit more granulated than the rice flour, which is nice. And then, so I gave you on that sheet a recipe for homemade almond milk, which is something that I think is really, really fun. If you've never done it, to try, and it is actually a very traditional Sephardic beverage, almond milk. There's also a version made with cantaloupe seeds that's traditional to drink on the Jewish New Year called pepitada. That's made with cantaloupe seeds, and it's very good. I gave you a recipe. I myself am just, because of my equipment shortage, I'm just using regular almond milk. But to add a kind of creamy element to it, you can also get these almond and coconut creamers from like Whole Foods and other health food stores. And this will give it kind of like a nice thickness. Not super, super traditional, the coconut, but still delicious. And it'll add kind of a...
Enjoying this?
Yeah.
So this is like 4 cups of almond milk that I'm just gonna pour in here. And you can do this with dairy milk as well. So you can do 5 1/4 cups of almond milk. You can do oat milk. You can do soy milk. Any dairy substitute you want. This is a great recipe for folks in your family, in your life, who might be gluten-free and who might be dairy-free as well. Or you can go full tilt on the dairy. Or if you're cooking a parve meal, almond milk is also a great substitute, and it goes back to the medieval era, which I think is very cool. Or you can, again, use a dairy milk, use whole milk. And if you want to really up the dairy factor and the creaminess, you can actually, that last 1.25 cups can be cream if you so desire. So if you're really going for it, you can do that. So that is that. And I'm actually going to take out a spoon and stir that, and I'm just going to bring this up to a boil. And as I'm rolling out my dough, you can already kind of feel it thicken. It's already like thickening the milk, but I'm going to bring it to a boil, and I'm going to watch it. And especially if you're using dairy milk, please watch this very carefully, because dairy burns very quickly because of the sugars in it. There's less sugar in non-dairy milk, so they lack the lactose, right? And lactose is a sugar that loves to burn and burn quickly. So I'm just going to watch this, and for my folks who are making it with milk, again, if you're making it with milk, watch it, stir it frequently, don't ignore it. Okay, that's that. Now we're going to turn back to our squash and our bananas, okay? Cool. So going to clear off some working space here, because we're going to roll this out. We're going to stretch and roll it. So this is the part on the food cooking shows that they don't show you, the moving stuff. Okay, cool. So now here's where I'm gonna lightly flour my surface, because I do want a little bit of dip. Or rather, I'm not gonna flour my surface, I'm gonna lightly flour my hands. So I'm just gonna take some flour, I like to do it like this, and I'm just gonna rub my hands in it. I'm gonna take one of my balls of dough here. And you can do this many ways. So if you bought a dowel, a dowel is a great thing to use here. And again, I'm watching my pudding so it doesn't burn. In the meantime, giving it a nice stir. Okay, it's already thickening, which is great. So I like to usually start this out just by kind of stretching it like a pizza dough, because we really want to get like a nice thin sheet here. So I just kind of take it from all edges, and I'm trying to get it kind of even, right? Because I don't want rips. So I'm just so gently just draping this dough over my knuckles and in a circle, just kind of pulling it. It's just so lightly. And this is how we'll kind of make sure that we get a nice even sheet of dough. But we can see, right, it's already, and I like to kind of like, I'll like open my hands gently, like kind of like in that motion, right? But very gently, right? So we don't tear it. And we, you know, you'll get a tear and that's okay. And then I will actually just let the dough kind of use itself as gravity. And to pull, and you can already see like how transparent it's kind of getting, right? Which I think is kind of amazing. Just goes to show you can make really cool things without mega equipment. And I'm now going to kind of put it down on my work surface. And you can roll this out. I admittedly don't have a rolling pin, but I actually don't generally use, when I make this, I don't use a rolling pin so much anyway. I actually do a kind of pulling like this. And you can see, I don't know if you can kind of see that, how like transparent it is. Maybe my camera is not so good. If you want, you can, here I am using a glass. You can also use a wine bottle as a roller, which I've been next to. But I don't know if you can kind of see how, oops, there we are, how transparent it is. You can kind of see my fingers through, right? So that's what we're going for. We're going for like a nice transparent rectangle.
So we do see it, but 2 questions are coming in. Someone said, "Oi, don't forget to stir the soup."
Yes, I was just doing that. Thank you for the reminder.
And someone else wanted to know if you can use store-bought Filo dough.
Yes, you can definitely use store-bought Filo dough. It's going to be thinner and more delicate, so you have to be a little careful with it. But it is definitely something that can be used. And actually, in the meantime, I'm going to kind of turn our soup down. It started to boil, which is great. I'm going to let it kind of slowly thicken now. The question about the store-bought phyllo is great. Store-bought phyllo is made by a machine, so it's going to be more perfect and it's going to be much thinner than we can roll out. So your ultimate product is going to be more kind of strudel-like than something like this, which is also in its way a type of strudel, but you'll find that like it'll be a little bit more delicate. But if you do it this way, you get kind of like a heartier chew. So I'm just kind of very gently pulling this sheet. And again, I'm gonna just use the dough to pull itself. And of course, I'm getting some holes. That's okay. We're gonna roll it up. It's not a problem. But the weight of the dough itself, it really starts to become a sheet. A dowel is great for this, or if you want to use a rolling pin, use a rolling pin that has equal edges. Okay, and just so you can kind of see what happens now, because I want to leave time here. Okay, so how am I going to construct this bollo, this bulema? I'm going to take some oil. I've got some oil here. And if you have the tool, you could use a brush. I don't currently have a brush, but I'm going to use a spoon and I'm just going to kind of brush oil. I'm using vegetable oil onto this sheet of dough and making it nice and covered. And again, you can kind of use the spoon as well, or the brush, to get a little bit more length on your sheet. I'm gonna stir my soup. Oh, and I'm going to actually show you the soup so you can see, because it's getting really nice and thick now. You can kind of see it when I stir. Hopefully, you can kind of see the spoon marks. It's a lot thicker.
Yes, we can see that. Great. Oh.
Great. So we're going to keep that going until it gets even just a little bit thicker. Okay, so when I'm spreading this oil out all over this sheet of dough, I'm not leaving any space uncovered here. Just like this. And again, you can use it to kind of push out. And then I'm going to take my squash filling on one edge here of this dough. It's going to make a line of filling.
So it's not really a puree, it's kind of lumpy.
Yeah, it's sort of like a mash, and you can make it more pureed for sure if you have the equipment first, and also to your preference. Like I said, when I have a lot of equipment and I'm using a masher, I always leave a couple of pieces unmashed because I like the texture of it. You can also make it into puree, and actually you could, if you wanted to, you could have just pipe it across, right? So that's a kind of neat way of doing it. But I like this way. It's sort of more homemade, but I'm just gonna take that edge of dough, right, that we made, and I'm gonna sort of use the weight of this filling to allow the dough to stretch over it. And I'm gonna kind of gather it with my hands, again, and make like a little tight cigar. And then I'm gonna flip it, right, and just roll a kind of really tight cigar with this dough.
Sara, I took the spotlight off your face just so we can really focus on your hands here.
Yeah, that's great. So, right, I'm really maintaining this very tightly wound piece of dough, right? And just, I'm using it even in each moment. I'll even pull the cigar and kind of roll it over itself. Just do a pull and a fold, pull and a fold. And you can do this until you get to that final edge of the dough. And that's how you'll make sure that you get this really nicely, evenly rolled cigar. But it also is just a very nice little package. And I'm just gonna take those final ends and kind of roll them over. And that means that you never really get a piece of dough that's a little bit too thick. Again, I'm gonna stir my soup, getting it nice and thick. Okay, and then this is where the shaping comes in. So this is where it becomes a boyo or a bulema. So I'm gonna take one end of this nicely, tightly rolled cigar that I've made, and I'm just gonna turn it in on itself, right? So here it is, and I'm just gonna kind of keep turning it into a little snail's shell all the way until the end. And then what I like to do with this end piece, when I have about like, I guess it's about 3 inches, I'm just actually gonna pull it and turn it as far as I can around and tuck it under. And then you have this adorable little roll. There it is. And then I'm gonna put it on a baking sheet that's prepped with parchment paper. I'm gonna brush the top of it with oil, and if you want, you can put sesame seeds. So I'm gonna quickly pause here because I wanna show you the pudding and sort of the last touch that you do to it. Okay, so we've got our lovely thickened pudding. I'm gonna actually turn it out into this bowl.
There was a question about that as well, if it needed to be a specific type of rice.
It doesn't need to be a specific type of rice. You can buy white rice flour or brown rice flour in your supermarket. Bob's Red Mill brand, I love, that's what I'm using. I'm using white rice flour. I don't know if you can see. I really like this brand. It's not an ad, I promise, but it's a really good quality brand. It's very evenly milled. Okay, so we can see kind of, here, I'll show you actually with a spoon. What we're going for when we know this pudding is done is what's known as the spoon test. So I'm gonna take a spoon, take the back of it, let it kind of run down, and delicious. See how clearly defined that line is? That's the consistency. That's how you know that your soup is done, when it holds that line. So that's great. And then to finish it off, I'm gonna take, this is traditional in Turkey, but you can kind of play with it as you want. I have orange blossom water, which I think smells divine and delicious. and is very traditional in, again, in Turkey and Iran and Iraq and Middle Eastern Sephardic communities. I'm just gonna top this off with the tiniest bit to start. Maybe that's like 1/4 of a teaspoon. I don't want to overwhelm. For some people, it kind of tastes like soap, so I'm not trying to overwhelm. You can also do this with vanilla extract or any other type of extract that you like. And I'm just gonna kind of stir this in, and then I'm going to top it with some cinnamon. You can also chop up almonds and pistachios on here, but it's a really beautiful bowl of soup that just smells amazing. So that's our soup.
Do you eat that as a dessert?
You can eat it as a dessert. You can be like Perla Cheftal and serve it for breakfast if you want. It's sort of like
a little sweet.
It is sweet, and traditionally, so in the Sephardic tradition, you eat sweet and savory things at once. So actually, it's something that you can eat alongside other things to kind of balance out the savoriness, and that's something that comes from the Muslim heritage of the Sephardic community. But for our purposes as a society that kind of likes an order of things, and you can serve it as a dessert, you can serve it as it's a great afternoon snack. It's traditional also in Sephardic households to actually serve this right after breakfast. So on Yom Kippur, the first thing that you eat in the new year, sutla or rice soup, depending on what you call it. So I'm gonna stay here, and actually I'm gonna roll out another bulema, but I do want to be mindful of people's times because I see that it's already 4 p.m. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining me for this first session. I hope that I'll see you for next session. We'll be diving into the Ashkenazi Delta. We'll be looking at a different region, a little bit of different history, and continuing this picture of Southern Jewish food that we're drawing together with more delicious recipes, and you'll get those recipe sheets this week. Yes, but thank you so much for being here, and hopefully I'll have better kitchen equipment next time as well. But hopefully you still learned something. It was a joy to meet you all, and hopefully I'll see you next Sunday. If you want to stick around and make another bulema with me, you're so welcome. I would love that. But if not, I'll see you next Sunday. Thank you all so much.
For those of you who are sticking around, feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to chat, or to use the chat function as well. We're just so happy to have everyone with us. And any questions? Sarah, a question came in. What are the approximate dimensions of the dough before filling it?
Before filling it, I think that's like I would call that like a 10 by 14 rectangle.
It says on the printed directions, give amounts, give sizes. If you look at, and I'm going to leave, but thank you very much. I'm sure we're going to try those because they look delicious.
Wonderful. I'm so glad, Naomi. Thank you so much for coming and for participating. It was lovely to meet you.
My head husband makes a lot of bread and has made strudel, so I think this will not be that hard.
This is, he's going to be a pro at bulemas. It's very much like strudel.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Sarah, in case there was any question as to whether or not this was an officially Jewish program, it is, because we now have someone asking if you know somebody else. So now that the Jewish geography has commenced, we know that this was a full Jewish program. Roberta Friedland wants to know if you know Professor Devin Narr from Washington University in Seattle.
I do know Devin Narr. He, my advisor from Tufts, Gloria Asher, invited him to speak right after I came back from Spain, and I met him at Tufts, which is my alma mater in Boston, in the Somerville, Medford area. So I do know Devin Narr. I am a huge fan of his work. I have used his book on Salonika many, many times and for many, many things. And if you haven't ever had the opportunity to see him speak, I highly recommend it. He's awesome. And the Stroom Center as well is just doing some really important work for Sephardic heritage writ large.
So not only is this Jewish geography, I mean, it's official Jewish geography because Devin is Roberta's cousin. So, I mean, this is really counts. So,
Oh my God, wow. I'm honored. I feel starstruck. He's been a big influence in my work. So it's really cool to meet his cousin. That's awesome.
All right, Roberta, you got to get Sarah something autographed.
Yeah. Or you can get him to read my dissertation. That's the real ask. But he's wonderful. And I actually, so for those of you who are interested in Sephardic culture kind of generally, I actually take a class with my advisor still through a congregation in New Mexico, and she actually teaches Ladino. So if anybody is interested in Ladino and wants that to be part of their practice and their Jewish life and Jewish historical knowledge, I'm happy to send the info to everybody who might be interested. And you can join and actually speak in some of the language and get involved. I see Judy's giving me a thumbs up. That's great. Okay, I'll send an email to Virginia and to Rabbi. And if you guys don't mind sending it to folks who've registered, that would be great.
That'd be great.
Okay.
Also,
oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say also, if you would update the Google Doc to include exactly how you cook the squash, yes. That would be great. It was mostly explained, but there may have been a few questions, and you said it so beautifully and quickly. That way, would be great to add on to that one.
Happy to do that. Okay, let me make a note of that quickly. Actually, I'll write it down later. That's great. Okay, so this is my second bulima, and you can actually see. I know this looks like a hole. There's actually dough here. This is as transparent as you get it. So I just, whenever I make this dough, I'm like awestruck by it. You just kind of pull.
Sarah, you may be interested to know that Mikveh Israel in Savannah still holds on to some of its Sephardic traditions, even though it's primarily Ashkenazic and has been for a long time, obviously.
Right.
We still use the Sephardic terms for our officers. The president is the Parnas. The board is called the board of a junta or a junta. We still sing occasionally we sing the En Kelahinu in Ladino.
Wow.
And we chant the El Norah on Yom Kippur.
Amazing. That's amazing. I love that. And I think, one of the things that I didn't say in my session, but I do think is very true and holds true is like, even though things might ostensibly be, labeled Sephardic or labeled Ashkenazi, it's really like a fluid thing, right? Many traditions kind of exist together at once. So you can have like an Ashkenazi liturgy, but you are singing in Kelahinu. I know congregations who also have like a mixed community and they sing Ukavritiko every Hanukkah, and I think there are some communities that have opted to actually always look towards the center, as in the Sephardic tradition where the bima is at the center of the congregation versus at the front, which comes from the German and the Ashkenazi tradition. And I think, it's a much more complex tapestry than those labels often kind of get across. But I love that you explained that. Thank you so much. And I'd love, one day to actually be in the synagogue.
Well, let us know when you can come. We also have the Torah still that was brought over in 1733. That was actually scribed in the 1400s.
Oh my God! They called it a Sefer Torah, right?
Yeah. It is probably the oldest item of Judaica in North America.
That is so amazing. Yes, I would love to see that. That's amazing.
And we have a new Torah that was brought over in 1737. It was also scribed about the same time in the 1400s, probably in Northern Africa.
I love that. And the new, quote unquote, the new Torah, right? That's amazing. Well, and what it kind of, I think what your point demonstrates is just like how deeply interconnected Jewish communities are throughout time and place. And it's something like liturgically we talk about, right? That we see ourselves as being present at Mount Sinai as if we ourselves were there and not just our ancestors. But I think it's so true for material objects in the Jewish tradition as well, like a Torah, food, art, like Judaica. These things kind of carry lives with them that I also think gets to that collapsed temporality that we all are part of.
We still read occasionally from the 1733 Torah.
Oh my God.
And you know, they also brought a circumcision kit.
Right, they had a one. Yeah.
We stopped using that a few years ago.
Yeah. I'm sure it was time to move it on. That's amazing. It's so cool.
EH, I'm so happy that you shared these stories. I had a chance to visit and meet briefly with your rabbi over the summer, and it's really exciting and inspirational. We're the oldest synagogue in North Carolina, but we barely hold a candle to y'all. But it's so important to hear this history. So I need to learn more.
Yeah,
we're happy to share our history. We, you know, before the pandemic, we used to get lots of tourists. And we're looking forward to being able to welcome tourists again.
Amen. Sarah, that's beautiful.
Yeah, here I'll just give you a look again. And I will send a picture of when they're baked so everybody can kind of see them. But they're just, like, I think they're just really beautiful little packages of yumminess. I like to put sesame seeds on them. For some reason, I couldn't find sesame seeds today when I went to the grocery store. I don't know if that's a Minneapolis thing. But if you were me, not in Minneapolis, and you had access to sesame seeds, I would put sesame seeds on the top of this. It's very delicious.
But in addition, speaking of sending the pictures and this being a cute little package, do you send these by package to those of us who, no, I'm just kidding, but
mail order. We can get a SAJE mail order going. All of these things. Yeah. So, but these are just, you know, of course I didn't have equipment today, but I hope it's a testament to how you can still make really delicious food with very little available to you, and how that's kind of in a way carrying on the tradition that we've been a part of for so many hundreds of years as well. Jewish cooks throughout time making delicious things to show their Jewish identity.
Abby put a great question in the chat. Do you make any recipes with saffron? She grows her own.
You grow your own saffron.
Ooh, wow.
That's amazing. I'm actually going to bring you guys over to take a break to answer your questions more readily. I do make recipes with saffron, although they're not necessarily like Southern Jewish recipes, but I do make a pretty good like Moorish, what you could call it, quote unquote, Moorish rice, which is what paella is based off of. For those of you who keep kosher, I have a vegetable version that uses saffron that's really, really delicious. You can also, speaking of saffron, that is a great addition to the rice soup. You can actually add it. It will add this like really beautiful perfume element, and it will color it this just gorgeous golden hue. So if you want to take your homegrown saffron and add it to the rice pudding or the rice soup, that would be an excellent addition.
Yeah, they're just coming up now, and they should be ready for harvesting in about 2 to 3 weeks.
Amazing.
It's the real deal.
That's amazing. I'm so impressed. That's so cool.
Where are you located, Abby? I didn't know we could grow saffron here.
I did get them from 2 mail order companies, started out 2018, and they'll sell you the bulbs. They were really growing happily. I just divided them in August, and all of them are coming up. I've got 60 little groupings of them, and I mark them with white plastic stakes, and it looks like I'm growing white plastic stakes. It's very interesting if you have another suggestion instead.
I love that. That's
But
amazing.
the labor intensity of it's not as if it can't be grown because they're doing beautifully. It's just that every single flower needs to be pinched off. They'll have 5 petals. I will pinch it off midday, strip them down, pull out the stigma, and then leave it to dry on a white paper towel for a couple of days, and they're ready. So I store them away quite carefully. I'm not totally into rice. I'm a big dough baker. So I did make a beautiful saffron kranz, which is a wreath, and you're flavoring the dough with a bit of vodka and warming it, and it goes into it's gorgeous.
Yeah. In a minute.
Yeah. You'll have to let me know if you want me to send you some. So it's not coming from Spain. I don't know where but it was from 2 mail order companies. That's all.
Oh my gosh. Well, I think that's amazing. I just think it's amazing that you're growing your own saffron. It gives you kind of the appreciation for it. And it was such an important part of the ancient Persian culinary repertoire, which is why it became such an ingrained aspect of Spanish cooking, because those are kind of the vestiges that we see that are still kind of holdovers from the medieval Muslim period of Spain.
Right. If you were putting it into, let's say, your soup, you would need to develop it in a little bit of the warmed liquid first.
Yeah, totally. And you can just
so that anything that you want, and gradually about 20 to 30 minutes, and you'll see that color, and
right.
It's gorgeous.
Yeah, and I think it would be beautiful, and that's something that, like, with the orange blossom water and some cinnamon, I would even, if I were actually doing it with saffron, I would also like put some ground cardamom in there. Those are flavors that like go back hundreds of years to the medieval Islamic repertoire, and a lot of medieval Islamic dishes were made with saffron, and many of them were sweet, even though now I think we associate saffron as like a savory flavor. Originally, it was very much a sweet kind of, it was considered a sort of divine flavor.
The fragrance is unusual. So I'm not always keen on adding it to something else, but letting it shine forth. But there are lots of pastries that I like to make that have orange blossom and the rose water, and doing ma'amul.
Delicious, yes.
Yes, I have all the molds. I even got something interesting because when you're looking at whether it's Ashkenazi or Sephardi, it's where you came from and what your influence was and what was available.
Right.
So I'm always curious about something else, and I just fell into something called oreshki, which are supposedly Russian, but then a lady was saying on a Jewish cooking blog, she does it too. And I got the mold, and it's a little bit labor intensive, but so is picking saffron.
Totally, it all goes with each other. Yeah.
Sarah, I wanted to mention to you, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm in contact with a person who is one of the leaders of the Salzburgers Society of Georgia, and I invited her to join us. Which right at the end of the thing, about 10 minutes before it was over, she said, "I'm looking forward to it." I said, "We're finishing up now," but I'll send her the recording. And it was interesting because about 5 years ago, they had contacted Mikveh Israel about they were starting to celebrate their landing day, which is when they landed in Georgia, and they were trying to do something different, and they were trying to find the recipe for a good rice soup.
Right. Oh my God. Well, I would love to share the recipe with them.
Yeah, we sent several recipes. I think they tried 3 of them, and I know one of them wasn't the right one, but they were more soups. And so that's what we were going on. But
Yeah.
so I'm really excited to share what you printed. You're gonna did I hear you say you're gonna reprint that? Or
Yeah,
change
I'm gonna
that?
add some detail about how to roast the squash to the recipe sheet. So you'll get an updated sheet
Okay. Okay.
with that.
All right. But that'll be real. I think that's going to be great.
I think that's going to be great too. I'm honored. I'm so glad that I'm, doing.
And you had two different Sheftel descendants, at least two that I know of.
That is so cool. Wow, amazing. Thank you so much for that.
Yep. Thank you.
I hope they like the rice soup that I've offered. I think it's interesting, right? Like, you think it might be savory. We don't know. We don't have the detail of it.
Exactly.
But I think it's interesting to put yourself in the mind of the people of that moment and thinking, okay, what am I used to? What do I want to show people about me who maybe are not of my own community? And especially, I think, like, socioeconomic class is really important. And when you have guests and you're being hospitable, you want to kind of show off what you got, which made me think that it would be a sweet thing rather than a savory thing. But
it kind of comes over as sort of an oatmeal type of cereal type of thing, even though it's not.
Right. It's like rice grits.
Yeah, rice grits. I love it.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you. So great to have you here.
Probably will be here next week.
Yay, I can't wait. I'm delighted.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I know we got some information about you, but I forgot. What department are you in?
I'm in the Spanish and Portuguese Studies department.
Oh.
Yeah. So, and I'm actually I think I sent an incorrect bio. I'm actually in my second year currently.
I didn't mean to say first year. I apologize.
No, that's okay. I think I might have sent you the wrong bio. So that's on me. But
I think Heath has a question, or Heth, I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's Heath. And I have a comment, which is that I really enjoyed the presentation. Thank you so much for all of that. And I have something about the soup and something about the pastry.
Yeah.
So with the rice soup really reminds me of rice pudding.
Yes.
And I'm wondering why they would have gone to the trouble of making flour from the rice when they could have gotten, a very similar tasting product if they just used the whole rice grains. And then with the pastry, the boikos, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'm very curious about why you oil the entire inside of the dough, what that does to the texture and the taste.
Amazing. Those are two wonderful questions. I love them. Thank you for them. So to answer your first question, I think we can't say with exact science why a ground rice over a whole rice dish, but I think you always have to kind of think about the context when we're talking and thinking historically about food. Like, what were the people who were serving the food trying to kind of subtly communicate to those who were receiving the food? And if you think about the act of grinding rice, it is more labor intensive, it costs more money, and so because of that, it's a more ostensibly valuable product. Also, it could be maybe not related to the socioeconomic background that they were trying to present to their guests, right? Like, when we were welcoming people, hospitality, there's this desire to show that you have more maybe than you do, right? And to show off reputationally. It could be that. It could also be that, for example, being in the South where rice is being grown, that you have all of these different byproducts from the actual production of rice. And one of those byproducts is rice flour, and that's as readily available as whole grain. I think if we're kind of taking it back to like the medieval dish that this is based off of and the ancient Persian dish that this is based off of, different aspects of texture were really important to the ancient Persians and to medieval Islamic cooks. Smooth things were perceived as superior to things that were like maybe what we would call chunkier. And I think then there's always this aspect with food practices that's not really communicating anything except the heritage of where the dish is coming from. It's not trying to say, oh, we're so wealthy, or, oh, we live in this particular environment. Rather, it's just kind of a byproduct of, I was taught this by, you know, my mother or the chef of this palace, and that's how I know how to make it, right? As like, I think we all have with recipes that we learn, right? It's like some of the answer is, it's just because that's the way I was taught it, right? So I think it's sort of like all of those layers could potentially point to answers of why the rice flour. And I think that definitely, especially the last one kind of points to why, like now, nowadays, like modern Sephardic people and families will use rice flour instead of whole rice, versus like a more quote unquote Ashkenazi rice pudding that has the whole grain in it. So those are just some guesses. I wish I could give you a more specific answer, but that's how I would think about it when I'm kind of looking at a dish.
Well, it's a lot more than I ever would have imagined. It's a very rich answer. I love it.
Thank you. I'm glad. And then to your second question about the oil. So what happens when you cook a dough like Filo dough? So it has very little fat in it, and it's a very starch-rich dough, which enables the pulling of it. And so by adding a layer of fat, what that does is it creates air pockets that are crispy and like kind of luxurious feeling on your palate, like especially if you're using something like butter instead of oil. Oil is great, but if you want like a really kind of like rich sort of smoothness to the dough when you actually finally bite into it once it's cooked, you use butter. But that kind of layering of fat in between these layers of dough that are it's a mostly water-based dough, as it bakes, the water vapor is going to try and escape, and it's going to puff up the layers between the fat and the dough. Sorry, I'm explaining this badly, but
no, I know exactly what you mean.
Right, and that makes it light and crispy and crunchy, and that's what the fat does. It's sort of like adding the fat after the fact to a dough, versus like with something like an enriched bread where you would be adding that fat directly into the dough so it rises. Here we're kind of adding it after the fact to get that texture.
The puff pastry.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay. Marvelous.